Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is the third in our Huck Catalysis series. Today we're going to focus on budgeting for complex grant proposals. My name is Brittany Grimes, and I'm a project manager with strategic initiatives here at Huck, and I'll be your moderator for this session. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is going to be recorded, and we will share the recording and any relevant materials with you afterward. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A and we'll address them during the end when we have some time saved for Q&A. As you all may know, budgeting is a crucial part of any grant proposal, ensuring research objectives are well supported and aligned with institutional and funder expectations. Today, we'll explore some key strategies for effective budget planning to strengthen your proposal and improve funding success. And we are fortunate today to have with us three subject matter experts with extensive experience in research and administration and grant proposal development. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to them to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I am Emily Martell. I am the Managing Director for Huck Institute Civil Life Sciences, and I've been at the university about 20 years, either serving as a financial officer or doing some sort of post-award type of research administration. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Rudy, and I'm the Associate Director for Pre-Award Research Administration in CIRO. And I've been with Penn State for 18 years, 10 years in post-award and 8 years with pre-award. And it's nice to be here today.
Hi, I'm Mary McMonigal, a contracting officer with OSP, and I've been supporting pre and post-award research at Penn State for about 14 years, and I just recently moved to OSP.
Before we dive into today's discussion, we'd love to get a sense of where our audience stands when it comes to grant budgeting. So here we have a couple poll questions. First, have you ever prepared a grant proposal budget before? And second, what did you find to be the most challenging part of that? Looks like 59% have prepared a budget before, and 44% think all of it is difficult or challenging.
That's great, because we're going to go over all of it, so this is good. So we will jump right in. We have 1 hour and we have lots to go over. So the objectives for today are first, to talk about strategies for using your statement of work as a base to create a comprehensive budget that allows you to accomplish all your project goals. So those two things should be really closely aligned. And we're going to give you an overview of key budgeting components for large grants and talk about how to estimate labor costs and other direct charges. We're going to talk about F&A and also research incentive funds. And then also how we're going to talk a little bit about what cost share is, but also how and when to request cost share funding. So our first, this slide is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's just a list of policies that are really helpful if you need more information on budgeting for, or how to calculate different costs for your budgets. Brittany will also be putting all the links to all of our links for websites that we reference throughout this in the chat for you. Okay, and Mary is going to talk about statement of work.
As Emily mentioned, our first objective is your statement of work, and it should be clear and concise, which will change this image of chaos into a streamlined flowchart. Your statement of work is the framework for all the documents in your proposal packet, including your budget, which will be our focus today. And your statement of work and corresponding budget should be your ideal proposal plan. If it works out that the budget doesn't align with the sponsor's limit, then you may need to reduce the statement of work or find, maybe use a different process to complete the deliverables. And we will discuss some of these options in future slides. And here is an example of a clear and concise statement of work. I want to make note of some possible keywords. Not available using traditional materials, and unique mechanism for developing, These words may represent more than just the research method that you will be detailing. They could also represent specific equipment or materials that are needed to complete the research, which we would want to note in the budget and budget justification. Does this image overwhelm you more than the project board that was in disarray a few slides ago? We trust our presentation today will help calm those feelings. Also know that the research administrator assisting you with your proposal can further clarify any budget areas of concern. Each section of this budget will be discussed in more detail throughout the presentation. For now, a quick overview shows us that based on our statement of work, we have budgeted the personnel needed to complete those tasks, the associated fringe for their salaries, materials, supplies, and purchase services the personnel will use to conduct the research, tuition for the grad students, participant support costs, and finally, the F&A or indirect costs. As we look at each of these costs, we need to ensure that they meet all three of the costing principles on this slide. Is it allowable? Does the solicitation or the sponsor generally make note that any costs are prohibited, such as equipment or certain travel? Is it allocable? Will the items be purchased or provided during the period of performance and used solely for this award? For example, a computer. Will the computer be for personnel that was budgeted for 100% effort or 50% effort? If for 50% effort, then no more than 50% of the computer should be budgeted to this award. Is the cost reasonable? Is the computer cost reasonable for the functions needed? You know, if you're just doing basic computing, does your computer align with that? Or did you get one with high processing speeds or video imaging features? Are the travel costs within the IRS travel limits for the location and only for the time period needed? Thinking about our statement of work, any unique material or services needed should be detailed in the budget justification that has been identified in the budget. Why an ordinary one would not work for this experiment. And some examples about meeting all three of these criterias. If the travel is reasonable and allocable, but is excluded from the solicitation, that would make it non-allowable. If you budgeted for a postdoc at 50% effort to align with their tasks in the data collection during the first half of the year at the standard rate for their experience, then it would be allowable because it's needed, so it's allocable, it's reasonable, and the sponsor does not prohibit the postdoc being on the proposal. And now I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Thanks, Mary. Going here. So we are going to dive into kind of building a budget. And so the first thing you need to kind of understand is the 4 cost categories that we will focus on. So there's direct labor, which is your salary and wages, and then fringe benefits, which are negotiated rates annually, that can change annually, that are part of every salary and wage dollar charged. Then there's other direct costs that we're going to talk about, like subcontracts, consultants, equipment, all those other things, all non-personnel type expenses. And then F&A costs, facilities and administration costs, which is our rate. We'll dive more into that too. So we are going to kind of chunk out that spreadsheet that Mary showed you by section and by cost category. So our first cost category we're going to talk about is labor. And this is just what a quick spreadsheet of the labor would look like, listed out. I showed the percentage of effort. We calculate our labor based on percent of effort. And I showed the current fringe rates. Those are calculated annually. And there's a summary page that you'll get access to that shows you all of our rates. And we're going to provide a link to the OSVPR site that has that summary page on every year. It's also a really good idea, I think, when you're thinking about proposing a really large project, that before you even meet with your pre-award person, or when you first meet with your pre-award person, that you mock up what you think the budget might look like in an Excel sheet before putting it into our system called Sims that we use. So step one, after you've got your statement of work all done, should be looking at your labor, what you're going to need in your budget. So identify your PIs, your co-PIs, all your key personnel and other personnel, and really think about how much effort they're going to need to spend on this project each year. Remember that fringe needs to be added to all the base labor amounts. So you'll be able to calculate that. When you're thinking about your labor, we really can't say really enough, encourage you to include a project manager for large interdisciplinary grants. They could be so important to helping to coordinate all the functions of the projects, to keep everybody on track, to be that point person for all the administrative folks, finance teams and finance offices, and communications teams who can't be charged directly to the grant because they're part of the F&A. And they can just be that point person to make sure that everything's moving smoothly. They can also be the person that does all the reporting for your program managers, your annual reporting. They're just I think they're key personnel for large interdisciplinary grants. So want to think about that, including GAs. When you do, you need to make sure you're thinking about the fall, spring, and we suggest summer semester stipend. And one note is that summer stipend for students, for graduate assistants, is charged a lower percent of fringe. And so they're only charged the wage fringe, which is like 8%. So it's much less over the summer. And also you need to think about including tuition if you're going to have grad assists as part of your labor, because we can't appoint a graduate assistant and pay them stipend without also paying the tuition. So that has to be accounted for someplace, whether it's cost share or in the actual grant. You just have to make sure you account for it. And you only have to account for tuition for fall and spring. If a student decides to take courses over the summer, it is paid for by the graduate school. So the grant or anyone else would not have to fund that. If you're including postdoc scholars, just always be aware there's a minimum salary requirement. There's also a minimum grade requirement for grad assists, but you do need to make sure that you're at least at the minimum. So we included the links to those tables below, so you can check on that. And then you just want to add any part-time positions. If you need a part-time research tech or whatever, you can factor those folks in. And then the fringe benefits rate will be factored in based on the category of personnel. I will show that in a future slide here. Another thing to think about when you're budgeting your labor is that some funding agencies have a salary cap. NIH is a great example. They have a salary cap. So you want to make sure you're within that cap. And you can work with your pre-award research admin team and post-award to manage those caps if you need to. Penn State also, along with a lot of funding agencies, require a minimum percent of faculty effort. So all senior personnel on a project are expected to allocate a percentage of their effort to the sponsored award, either as a direct charge or cost share. Unless it's the type of grant that doesn't require effort, there aren't many, but like an instrumentation grant would be a good example of that. So one thing to note is that every college has a slightly different, not all colleges have the same minimum requirement for the percent of effort. So if you're not sure what your minimum is, definitely check with your college research admin folks or whoever you're working with on your grant, your proposal submission, and they can let you know what that percent is. So salary budgets are based on a percent of time or percent of effort. So you'll hear that a lot. What's the percent of effort going to be? And a lot of times we base that calculation on weeks. So typically an academic or faculty appointment is a 36-week appointment. It doesn't have to be, but this is what we see most. And then summer months can also be charged on grants via supplemental one pay, which we'll touch on in the next slide. And that's typically 12 weeks over the summer. Doesn't have to be set up that way, but that's the majority of folks. For an annualized salary or annualized weeks of 48 weeks. So if we were going to calculate an academic year percent of effort for someone that said, I need to put 1 week per month on this grant, that's how much time I'm going to spend on it. We would calculate 1 week per month for 9 months, 9 weeks divided by 36 weeks, and that's 25% of effort for the academic year. When we say academic year, we're usually talking about August 15th to May 15th, because that's the typical 36-week academic year contract. It doesn't always have to be. Some faculty are 48 weeks or some 36-week contracts are actually spread across the entire year with 3 weeks per month on contract and 1 week per month off. So there can be differences. So if you annualize that, you'd have 18 weeks per year. 18 weeks over 48 weeks, if you add in the summer, is 37.5% effort. So that's the calculation that your pre-award folks will do to calculate the percent of effort. And every PI is responsible for certifying effort on their grants, both annually and at the end of the grant. And when you certify it, you're basically looking at all the labor charged to the grant for which you're responsible and saying, yes, this is correct, and this is the amount of effort that they spent. During the certification process, it's really important to look closely at the effort, and that is a good time. If you find a mistake, you can fix it before you certify it. So that's a good time to make sure there are no issues, and you don't see someone's effort on there who, oh geez, they went to work on another project 6 months ago, and I forgot to move them. The post-award staff can help you fix that if you need to, but effort certification is really important. And it's built into Simba, and there's an automated workflow, but it's something that you'll have to do if you're a PI. So supplemental one payment is an extension of a faculty member's contract in weeks, and it's considered institutional based pay. So it will show on your effort reporting along with your 36-week contract pay. So only faculty working less than 48 weeks are eligible for supplemental one payments. And again, it can be paid for any of the weeks between, the weeks the appointment up to 48 weeks. So a really good example, and the most common example, is the 36-week appointment is eligible for 12 weeks to get them up to that 48-week point. So if they're working on the grant during their 36-week contract, but then say, hey, I'm going to work on it over the summer too, they're eligible to be paid from the grant for their effort for another 12 weeks or 33% of the salary. So again, it is typically paid over the summer months, but it can also be paid 1 week per month throughout the year, depending on the effort distribution type you are in the system. And that's all managed in labor distribution by your post-award folks. And then we just make sure that you're coordinating with your post-award folks to determine whether your effort's going to be distributed from your base 36-week contract or it's going to be part of supplemental one. Supplemental two payment is almost never charged to grants, but I wanted to show the difference there because a lot of times when you're looking at university policy, it has both together. Supplemental two is really considered like overtime. And it's not considered institutional based salary, so it will never show up on effort certification. Another reason we don't charge it to grants. And it's really used for work above and beyond your contract. So if you're on a 36-week contract, and during that 36-week contract, you take on another course and you teach overload, that's typically paid as supplemental two payment. So not necessarily related to a grant or the budgeting, but I just felt it was important to show the distinction between the two so you have that information. So after you've got all your labor figured out, you'll need to calculate your fringes on that labor. And different labor categories have different fringe rates, depending on, how they're, what fringe benefits they get. So the fringe benefit costs include health insurance, workers' compensation, life insurance. Social Security, Medicare, retirement, educational benefits, and other. And it's a fixed percentage of the labor that's applied, and that can change during the life of the grant from year to year. And like one example of fringe being different across categories is like our wage employees who are only working part-time. Well, they're not eligible for health insurance. So their fringe rate is going to be much, much lower than our salaried employees who are eligible for that, because that cost isn't included in their calculation for wage folks. And this is just a table that you'll find on the summary sheet that Brittany is going to make sure everyone gets a copy of. And they change from year to year. But this is the breakdown of this year's fringe rates for everyone. And you'll see the different categories. Graduate assistants are only 12.9%. Wage employees are 8%. If a student is on a wage appointment and they're registered for full-time, they're only 0.3%. So they have really low fringe rate. So we just provide an example down below for you to how to calculate the fringe. It's basically just the base amount of pay or the base amount of effort times the percentage, and that's your fringe rate. And you add that to your base pay for a total cost.
Okay, then we're going to move on to step number 2, where we're going to identify our other direct costs that are non-personnel costs in the budget. As a tip, subawards should be identified early. Your research administrator is going to work with you or work with a contact person at the other institution or your subaward area. So it's definitely important to identify those early. Some other items that are in the other direct cost category, of course, will be your materials and supplies, your travel, participant support cost, internal and external services. And when I mention those, I want to just point out, don't forget to budget for any internal Penn State core facilities that you may need. That's something that sometimes gets slipped and missed. So just make sure you don't forget about the internal core facilities that you may need here at Penn State. Regarding cost allowability, you want to make sure to review if there's any cost from the sponsor that are not allowable. Sometimes in a solicitation, there are costs that they specifically say are unallowable to budget. So you want to be aware of any of those items, as well as even caps on specific line items. So of course, I think Emily talked about, there are salary caps. There are also sometimes caps within the other direct cost categories that can have limits as well. And here, again, this is the part in the budget. In the beginning, you saw the overall budget. This is the part that includes the other direct costs. And you can see some examples here. We have our equipment, the Huck core facilities, lab supplies, an external evaluator, which would be a consultant. See our travel is budgeted here. And then down in the bottom section, you'll see the tuition and our participant support cost are in the bottom section. And we're not going to go into a deep dive on this, excuse me, right now. But the reason they're in the bottom is because those particular costs would not incur F&A on a typical budget. Not always, but on a typical budget, those are costs that normally do not incur F&A expenses. And now with, again, building the budget here with this, we want to be sure to estimate the cost accurately. Make sure you're getting quotes from vendors or service providers, because you really want to make sure these items are as accurate as possible. Some costs you may already be familiar with. These are going to be some of your common costs on maybe other projects that you've done or items that you've purchased in your lab. So some things you just historically know what some of those costs are. Regarding travel, you want to research those for your transportation, lodging, and per diem. Use Concur to get the current rates. Again, Brittany will put these links in the chat for everyone, but there is a link there to go to Concur where you can put in your airline and get the estimated cost for where you'll be traveling to, as well as going to the GSA website to get the current per diem rates for the area that you'll be traveling to. Also be sure to research and get market rates for your consultants and subcontractors. Definitely don't be kidding. Make sure you go out and get as accurate as possible for those costs. And here, you want to be mindful of being able to justify the need for the cost. And basically, why is the cost essential for the project? So as you're building your budget, these are things you want to keep in mind. Why do I need this cost for my project? Keep in mind that the reviewers for the proposal submission, these are people who do understand your project and will be able to compare the budget with your statement of work and to know if your budget is reasonable to complete that statement of work. One, is there enough budgeted, or is there too much budgeted? So your reviewer will be able to, match that statement of work with your budget. So having a realistic budget is really important to ensure your chances of getting the award. Also, again, we've talked about policies throughout here. You want to be aware of any relevant policies and allowable rates, because we want to make sure, we're compliant with anything that we're doing within the budget. Your large and major costs should be broken down. If there's a very large line item that consists of multiple things within that line item, you want to be able to, whenever you get into your budget justification, be able to break that down. So for an example, with equipment and consultants, for equipment, you can break down into components, maybe the per unit of equipment, and for consultants, the number of days of consultancy. And then once you feel you have all your costs captured in your budget, once you think you have it all put together, walk away, come back an hour later, and then take a look at it again, because you want to make sure there's not something that you miss. So you'll see the pie chart there, and we want to make sure that we've captured everything that we need in our budget and that we've not missed anything, because it is easy to do, to miss some small items.
One thing to note too, if you forget to budget something and you need to change it after you've been awarded the grant, it can sometimes be really hard to do that. You typically have to get sponsor approval. There's restrictions on how much you can change. So it's really good to put the work into getting it right before you go into the actual award. So F&A costs and their purposes. F&A, or facilities and administrative costs, typically intended to cover the cost of resources that support research in the project, but aren't directly involved in the actual project. So that would include administrative salaries, a department's finance team or finance office who approve all the transactions, office space, electricity, utilities, all those things that support research at this university that cannot be charged directly on the grant are part of the F&A. And the F&A is calculated annually by our cost analysis office and the Office of Budget and Finance. And they're able, all of the expenditures I referenced, administrative salaries, office space, all of that is tracked in their system and calculated each year to come up with the rate. So it's that 58.4% that we're charging this year is a real cost to the university. In fact, I think we actually spend a little bit more than that, but it's a real cost of like the infrastructure to help us to be able to do these projects. And the F&A will be charged as a percentage of most direct costs, like labor, wages, material, supplies. But there are some direct costs that aren't charged F&A that doesn't apply to, like a lot of times tuition and capital equipment right now that costs $5,000 or more or over $5,000. That's changing in July to I think $10,000. So there are some like participant support costs, also like research participants. Expenses for those folks are not charged F&A either. So that's why we typically keep them in the lower category that you saw in that spreadsheet. The F&A rates are on the same sheet as the fringe rates. So they're all summarized in one spot for you, but they change every year. And you can look at them on that rate sheet. One thing to note, sorry, I'm gonna get a drink of water, is that typically when you do a proposal, the fringe rate when you submit is the fringe rate for the life of the grant. So it doesn't change from year to year like fringe. And here's that budget spreadsheet, and I've highlighted the personnel costs and the other direct costs that do incur F&A. We've kept that tuition and participant support costs outside of the F&A calculation because it's not part of it. And then you can see highlighted in yellow, that's the calculated F&A on our personnel and other direct costs at 58.4%. So we have to factor that into the total. Now we've got another poll. So good job for those of you who picked labor. It would be, and also F&A is right too, actually, because there's F&A on the labor. Travel would be other direct costs and F&A, and could be cost share, yeah. Good job. Yeah, I think we got a good understanding of that. So research incentive funds, excuse me, are distributed annually. The colleges receive annual, we call them RIF funds, research incentive funds. Colleges receive annual RIF funds typically in January, and it's based on the previous year's research expenditures and the F&A collected. So it's 12% of the F&A for all sponsored awards with an F&A rate over 15%. And that amount is distributed to the colleges based on the faculty members' percent of credit on the grant. So this is really important when you're doing at the proposal stage and you're filling out that IAF for OSP. The distribution of the RIF is going to be based on how you fill out that percent of credit. And so sometimes a PI will say 100% credit for that PI and the co-PIs aren't on there. And in that case, 100% of the RIF funds, the 12% of the total F&A spent that year or incurred that year, would go to the college of that PI's, the PI's college, sorry. And if you split it maybe like 50-50 between you and your co-PI, then 50% would go to the PI's college and 50% would go to the co-PI's college, wherever that is. So keep that in mind when you're completing your IAF, because it really makes a difference in the end. The RIF calculation is managed and distributed by the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research annually. And if you're not sure how the distribution works in your college, check with your, maybe your assistant dean for research or your college research administration office. Colleges have different processes in place to determine how the RIF flows, whether the PI gets all of it, percentage of it. Sometimes the departments keep a portion. So check with your department head or your research admin office to find out how it works in your area. Also, then, you know, RIF fundings, you can't carry them forward typically, so keep that in mind, but they can be used to support research expenditures with the university or things that you normally wouldn't be able to necessarily charge on the grant, but you need to support your research. Those funds can come in handy at that time. So they're really important. Oh, and before, sorry, Diane, before you get started, I did want to mention too, I'm sorry, I did notice there are a lot of folks from Hershey on here, and I should have mentioned, there's a different F&A rate for University Park versus ARL versus Hershey. So, but that summary sheet should have all of them. I wanted to mention that too. And the research incentive funds could be a little bit different depending on, you know, the campus you're on as well.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about cost share. So the definition or you know, of cost share is these are contributions towards the project that are not going to be paid by the sponsor. Typically, the cost share comes from the institution. It can be from other sources. We're not going to go into a deep dive on that today, but there are different types of cost share. There is mandatory, which is reportable and it's committed to the sponsor. So mandatory cost share is typically it's required by the sponsor. It requires detailed financial reporting. It's included in the budget and the proposal. The sponsor is seeing it. And I have on the slide here, there's negative consequences for failure to meet. So cost share is very important that, you know, we've identified it, we have it approved, and we must meet that. And it's rarely negotiable. And then, so that is the mandatory that's reportable and committed to the sponsor. We also have voluntary cost share, which is reported and committed to the sponsor. In this particular case, it's not required by the sponsor, but it was included in the budget and the proposal. It still requires a detailed financial reporting. It's still has negative consequences if it is not met. And it's always cautious on doing voluntary committed cost share. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but just keep in mind that if it's not required and it has been committed to the sponsor, any funds that you commit, they can't be used for something else later. So once they're committed somewhere, they cannot be used elsewhere. And the other type of cost share would be the uncommitted voluntary cost share. Now, this is cost share that the sponsor, most likely, they don't see this cost share. So it's not included in the sponsor budget. It's for internal tracking only. There is no financial risk to Penn State, and it can be changed. And there is no, you'll see there's no such thing there as mandatory on the matrix, uncommitted report, non-reportable. But always remember that cost share must be allowable, allocable, and reasonable. So I want to slip back to if a sponsor budget limits a particular line item and they have any something that's not allowable on the sponsor side, it's not allowed to be used on the cost share side either. So they go hand in hand. Whatever a sponsor does not allow, we can't use that as cost share. If cost share is not required, it should not be included. And I don't know how much to emphasize. I can't emphasize this enough. If it is not required, it should not be included. Now, in research administration, we always say it depends. There is always a gray area in regards to cost share. But I always point out in typically most federal sponsors, especially, cost share, if it is not required, it cannot be taken into account in the review process. Now, as I said, there's always a gray area, and there are some federal sponsors where it might say it is not required, but it's encouraged, or it might say it's not required. NSF will have a statement that it is. So there's a statement between it's not required and it's not allowable. So those are two very different statements. So your research administrator will work with you very closely to help to determine if the cost share is required and should be included. But your project statement of work should be developed within the sponsor budget limits. So whenever I said if cost share is not required, it shouldn't be included, you want to develop your statement of work within the sponsor budget limits. And also keep in mind that we can't decrease the budget without decreasing the statement of work. So if you start to build a budget around a statement of work that you have and you're way over, and you need to pull that back drastically, you may need to take another look back at your statement of work. Let's see, I think we've covered everything on this slide. So continuing with the cost share, when it will be in the budget, we want to build the budget listing all items needed. This is my suggestion. When cost share is required, just build your budget with all of the things that you need to complete your statement of work. Then let's go back and take a look at what items we can move into cost share. So I've seen many times that PIs may build a budget and they're thinking, okay, I want to put this over here and then this will be cost share. Now, there are times that you already know what you are going to cost share, but if you're not 100% sure, one of the best ways to do it is forget about the cost share, build your budget all the way out, everything you need to complete your statement of work, then go back and take a look at, and we'll pull out the items that are needed to meet the cost share requirement. And so typically for cost share, we start with salaries, grad students, tuition. These are the items that are very easy for us to be able to see. They're much easier to cost share and to keep track of. But of course, other costs can sometimes be used as cost share. Again, you'll work with your research administrator to help determine what items would be best to use for cost share. And your research administrator will work with you to create a cost share approval request by organizing the cost and what areas will be asked to cover which parts. So in large, complex budgets, it's not uncommon for maybe 4 or 5 areas to be covering different parts of the cost share that's required for that particular submission. So your research administrator will be working with you to put that in an organized fashion, probably in an Excel spreadsheet, and getting that out for those cost share approvals. If possible, I recommend to PIs to let areas know in advance that you may be requesting cost share. So if you know upfront, even if you're thinking about a project that I'm going to need, X number of GIAs for grad students, you can go and start talking to your department head or areas about those, so that once you've built the budget and the research administrator is going out asking for those approvals, that hopefully is not the first time that area has seen that cost share request, that there has been at least a little bit of an advance notification. Because in the event that it is the first time they see that, and if for some reason they're unable to approve it, that means we have to go back and the budget's not finalized, and we've got to go back and start reworking the budget. So approvals need to be complete about 2 weeks before the sponsor deadline, and that's probably at the minimum. The earlier, the better. And our central match requests, they do have a process that your research administrator will take care of, and that's done through the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research. And Brittany will put the link there just for some information on that process, but your research administrator will be the one working to complete that central match. And next, we're ready for a poll. So we have a case study here. The sponsor comes back and asks you to reduce your overall budget by 10%. What do you do? So this is very common. This happens. We submit a proposal and we're, getting close to getting an award, and they say, okay, we love your project, but we need you to reduce your budget by 10%. So do we remove the direct cost and request more cost share, reduce the statement of work, remove a component, reduce the effort on the grant without changing the statement of work, or both A and B? We have both A and B, which is remove the direct cost and remove cost share, and reduce the statement of work to remove a component. And as I mentioned, C would not be the case, because if we're going to reduce the effort on the grant, we need to reduce the statement of work. Okay.
So we've covered most of our slides here. We just kind of wanted to go back to our objective slides and provide a summary. So, the first objective, coming up with strategies for your statement of work, just remember that your budget is a financial representation of your statement of work. So the closer they align, the easier it's going to be for you. And 2, be realistic and accurate. Check with seasoned PIs for tips and advice on calculating like travel expenditures and gratis type expenditures or anything like that. Or check with your research administrators who have experience doing this too, if you're not sure about the cost of something, or even if it's allowable. Work with your department heads or your research offices to learn about how your college distributes research incentive funds, and also plan and request cost share early. The earlier you do it, the better situated you are for success in getting all your cost share. And because there's almost every time we've negotiated cost share, when I've been part of it, we've had to pivot at some point when something didn't work out the way we thought it would, and figure out the next step. So the more time you have to do that, the better off you are, and the less stressful it will be for you too. So we left some time for Q&A. Brittany, did you?
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and open the floor for Q&A. So if you have questions, please put those into the Q&A section. You'll also see on this slide, there's two QR codes. So we'd love to hear your feedback about today's session and the first one, and you can find more information about our next session on the one to the right.
And this presentation will be up on the Catalysis website, right, Brittany?
Yes, yes. I will send a follow-up that has all relevant materials as well as a PDF of the slideshow that was presented today. Okay, so maybe Diane, Mary, could one of you answer what are the most common mistakes faculty make when preparing a grant budget?
I can, oh, go ahead, Mary, you
depends.
go.
What we usually say in research administration, it depends. I think one of the biggest areas is identifying subawards early. The need for subawards, as Diane mentioned, or Emily in their slide, that we need to be reaching out to that subaward entity for their documentation before we can complete our budget. Another one that I see is planning for grad students. Will you have multiple grad students on the project throughout the period of performance, or will it be one grad student? And so are you budgeting for full tuition the entire time, or budgeting part of the time with full tuition, part of the time with post-comp tuition?
Something I have seen in some of the larger proposals that we've submitted too is like sometimes all the labor will be, a lot of effort will be discharged or budgeted for the first year. And we're not thinking about kind of that ramp up time where we have to hire all these folks. And so sometimes you can go a little lighter on your effort the first year and then have more in following years. So something to think about, or sometimes I think it's really hard to estimate how much effort certain groups need to spend on a grant. Sometimes you find out like, oh geez, I only budgeted like 10% effort, but I really should have budgeted 25. So getting that right it can be really tricky. So it's really good to kind of think that through really carefully. And then the other thing I see a lot is waiting till the very last minute to negotiate cost share, and everybody's scrambling at the last minute. And I know that the folks who have to say yes or no to those commitment requests, like the deans and the department heads and so on, get really frazzled when they're sent a request and said the proposal's due tomorrow, and they get really frustrated because they're just like, well, I can't really think about this, and it's just not good. So the earlier you can think about your cost share and start making those requests, I think the more successful you'll be in getting yeses.
Thank you, Mary.
And I will just add, I know Emily mentioned this earlier, is especially for these large complex budgets, thinking about a project manager. I can't reiterate that enough. Having a project manager will really, really help out. And then I will agree with Emily, not only in the cost share, but the budget itself, having it finished very, very early. It actually helps a lot of different other processes. We need to get the IAF routed because there's some compliance items that your research administrator needs to know for the application based on information from the IAF, and we can't route that really until we have a final budget.
Thanks, Diane. Could one of you speak about what happens if actual costs differ from what was originally budgeted in the proposal?
That happens sometimes. And that's when you kind of need to work with your post-award team. There are different ways to manage it. You know, sometimes you're stuck. If the actual costs are really different and you did not budget for it and there's not funds in there, you could be stuck, and that could be difficult. But sometimes there are, like some NSF grants say, you can change your spend within categories by 10% or less without prior approval. Like, you have to know what's allowed and what's not allowed, and working closely with your post-award team is going to be really important there. But also, if it's really off and you need to really make a huge change to your cost categories, that's going to involve probably requesting formal approval from the program manager or the funding agency. And there's a process in place then to make changes once that permission is granted, but it might not be. So try to get your budget right initially.
Thanks, Emily. Looks like we have a question in the Q&A. Where will university costs be diminished to comply with expected reduction in indirect costs, and how can we help in our applications now?
That is a really tough
Dr.
question. Go ahead, Mary.
Dr. Reed had mentioned some of this the other day in his session. And right now the university is working as we have been based on the policies that are in place. It would be leadership and our negotiating office, which is the Office of Naval Research, to determine if we were going to get a new F&A rate. But as far as our current costs and implementing, if there was a reduction, it would cut the funding that's associated with the RIF funding and the other facilities and administration. Dr. Reed had mentioned the administrative part of the F&A is already capped at 26%, and the university's current cost for the administration side is 31%. So he did not see any way that could be reduced further. He also felt, based on that, and the Office of Naval Research sets our rates, he is not expecting that the 15% rate would be the new rate across the board. But until final determinations are made, we can't really plan on how that would be.
Thank you, Mary.
Right. And if it does go, if they are lowered significantly, it could really change the funding agencies we're working with. So, but we prefer to wait and see how it actually works out, because, you know, it changes every day, so you never know.
Thanks, Emily. So it looks like we might have time for one more question. Diane, you spoke about this in the presentation, but could you talk more about if an award would be more attractive to a funding agency if they included a high level of cost share?
Yeah, so that is that's a misconception. I'm not saying that there aren't cases where it will increase the competitiveness, but depending on the solicitation, depending on the sponsor and the way that it is worded within, some solicitations, cost share cannot give that proposal more weight. So if you think of it like this, Penn State is a very large R1 institution. There are small institutions who are also applying for funding as well. Our institution may have more resources than, say, a much smaller institution. So taking out that cost share competitiveness, that removes that and puts everyone on an equal playing field, because then you have to have your statement of work that fits within the sponsor budget that was put in place. So what I'm trying to say is that basically, just, you know, if the large institutions would, you know, take over and wouldn't allow any of the smaller institutions to be competitive if we continue to just add all of our resources in. So yes, in some cases you do need to add cost share, and in most cases you do not. But I hope that helps to answer that. But if cost share is not required, we shouldn't be adding it, because it typically does not make your proposal more competitive, typically. But there's always an anomaly or something that's different. So I don't want to say always.
Great. Thank you, Diane. So before we close, I just want to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise today, and to all of you for joining us. We hope this session provided valuable insights to help you navigate budgeting for your grant proposals. And again, just thank you for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.